At 9:17 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, watching the second wave of Japanese aircraft disappear into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor. Genda was the principal architect of the attack plan. He had spent 11 months refining every detail, calculating every variable, preparing for every contingency. He knew the American fleet strength down to individual destroyers. He knew their aircraft inventory. He knew their defensive capabilities. He had studied reconnaissance photographs until he could draw the layout of Pearl Harbor from memory. But there was one number. Genda and the entire Japanese naval intelligence apparatus had catastrophically wrong. A number that would determine the outcome of the war before a single shot was fired. The Japanese High Command estimated that by December 1943, the United States Navy would have 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The actual strength on that date was 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 343 enlisted personnel. They had miscalculated by a factor of more than 7 to 1. This was not a small intelligence error. This was not a rounding mistake or a misplaced decimal. This was a fundamental failure to understand the enemy they were fighting. And by the time Japanese intelligence discovered the truth, it was already too late to stop what was coming. The man who first noticed the discrepancy was Ensign Tao Yoshikawa. Yoshikawa was not a traditional intelligence officer. He had been a promising young naval aviator until a stomach ailment ended his flying career in 1936. Unable to fly, he was transferred to naval intelligence where his analytical mind and photographic memory made him exceptionally valuable. On March 27, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Yoshiwa was sent to Honolulu under diplomatic cover using the alias Tadashi Morimura. His assignment was to observe American naval activity and report on fleet movements, base infrastructure, and defensive preparations. Yoshikawa was thorough. He took the public tour boat through Pearl Harbor. He rented small aircraft to photograph installations from the air. He posed as a tourist and memorized patrol patterns. He counted ships and aircraft and documented their positions. His reports were detailed and accurate. The problem was not what Yoshiwa observed. The problem was what Tokyo assumed about what he observed. Yoshikawa saw battleships and carriers and cruisers. Tokyo headquarters counted those ships and calculated the crews required to operate them. They used their own manning standards as the baseline. Japanese warships operated with lean crews, maximum efficiency minimal personnel. They assumed the Americans did the same. They were wrong. Japanese naval intelligence officers in Tokyo had access to extensive information about American naval practices. They received attached reports from officers stationed in Washington and other American cities. They monitored technical publications that documented American shipbuilding programs and naval construction. They analyzed captured documents and interviewed merchant sailors who had visited American ports. The raw data was available, but having information is not the same as understanding it. The intelligence apparatus suffered from fundamental organizational weaknesses that prevented accurate analysis. The Japanese Navy considered intelligence a secondary function far less important than operations or command. Operations divisions often ignored intelligence reports that contradicted their assumptions or challenged plans already in development. The Navy assigned relatively few personnel to intelligence work and treated the assignment as less prestigious than combat billets or command positions. Ambitious officers avoided intelligence assignments because they offered limited opportunities for advancement or recognition. This institutional attitude meant that warnings from intelligence officers carried little weight when they conflicted with operational plans already in motion. The cultural bias toward offensive action and decisive battle made it difficult for intelligence officers to argue for caution or restraint based on assessments of enemy capabilities. Captain Toshikazu Ome served in the operations section of the Naval General Staff and was responsible for long-range planning. Ome was an experienced officer who had spent years studying American naval capabilities and strategic doctrine. In the months before the war, WWII and his colleagues used available intelligence estimates to calculate how many ships the Americans could man, how many task forces they could field, and how long it would take them to replace combat losses. The calculations were methodical and detailed. They examined American naval construction programs and ship delivery schedules. They analyzed American training capacity and personnel development systems. They studied American logistics capabilities and supply infrastructure. Based on personnel projections that assumed American mobilization would follow patterns similar to Japan's own expansion, planners concluded that the United States Navy could sustain approximately 40 major combatants in the Pacific theater with limited ability to conduct simultaneous operations in multiple areas. This assessment was incorporated into Japanese war plans at the highest levels. The entire strategy of seizing the resource areas of Southeast Asia, establishing a defensive perimeter extending from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies and forcing a negotiated settlement assumed that American naval forces would be constrained by limited manpower. The Japanese believed they would be fighting a contained war against a numerically limited opponent who would eventually accept compromise rather than sustain a prolonged conflict. They were preparing for the wrong war. Why did intelligent, experienced officers all make the same fundamental error? The answer lies in what intelligence professionals call mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is the assumption that the enemy thinks like you do, operates like you do, and values the same things you do. The Japanese looked at American naval practices through a Japanese lens and saw what they expected to see. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized elite crews operating complex vessels with maximum efficiency, quality over quantity. Every sailor was carefully selected, extensively trained, and expected to maintain high-performance standards throughout their career. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not use reservists in significant numbers. They did not conduct mass recruiting campaigns. They did not believe in taking civilians and turning them into sailors in a matter of months. Their entire cultural and institutional framework emphasized careful development of professional personnel over years of service. Their peacetime navy of approximately 120,000 men expanded to only 300,000 by the end of the war, a threefold increase for years was considered rapid expansion by Japanese standards. They assumed the American approach would be similar. They assumed that building a navy required the same careful, methodical approach that Japan used. They were projecting their own limitations onto an enemy with completely different capabilities and completely different assumptions about how to mobilize a nation for war. The reality of American naval expansion was something Japanese intelligence had no context to imagine. In June 1941, the United States Navy had approximately 284,000 active duty personnel. This included officers, enlisted personnel, nurses, and support staff across all naval installations worldwide. 18 months later, in December 1942, that number had grown to 1,640,000. By December 1943, it reached 2,374,094. The growth was not linear. It was exponential. The rate of expansion accelerated as training facilities expanded, recruitment intensified, and the entire American industrial and social system oriented toward war production. The Japanese had studied American shipyards and knew the United States could build vessels faster than Japan. American construction statistics were published in trade journals and technical publications that Japanese intelligence officers read regularly. What they failed to understand was that America could simultaneously recruit, train, and deploy the personnel to operate those vessels at a pace that no other nation could match. The United States was not constrained by available manpower. The country had 131 million people in 1941. Approximately 50 million were men of military age, even accounting for agricultural deferments to maintain food production, essential industry exemptions to keep factories running, and physical disqualifications for health reasons. The pool of potential recruits was effectively unlimited. The Japanese Imperial Navy was drawing from a population of 73 million with far more rigid social constraints on who could serve. Women were not considered for naval service except in very limited administrative roles. Social class distinctions limited opportunities for many potential recruits. Educational requirements were strict. The mathematics of the situation should have been obvious. A nation with twice the population and far fewer social restrictions on military service could mobilize far more personnel. But intelligence analysis is not about what should be obvious. It is about what analysts are prepared to see. And Japanese analysts were not prepared to see an enemy that could expand its navy tenfold in less than 4 years. The first indication that something was wrong came in May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported an American task force centered on 2 aircraft carriers. Standard Japanese doctrine called for approximately 2,000 personnel to operate a fleet carrier, including the embarked air wing. 2 carriers meant roughly 4,000 American sailors in the immediate operational area. But radio intercept specialists monitoring American communications detected references to multiple task group commanders, extensive logistics ships providing underway replenishment, and screening forces far larger than expected for a 2-carrier force. The after-action analysis estimated American personnel in the operational area at between 7,000 and 9,000 for 2 carriers. That ratio was wrong. It suggested manning levels nearly double what Japanese planners had assumed. The intelligence was noted but dismissed. Task force commanders operate with different philosophies. Perhaps the Americans were simply less efficient with their personnel allocation. Perhaps they were overstaffed because of inexperience. The warning sign was ignored. The second indication came in June 1942 at Midway. The battle was a disaster for Japan. 4 fleet carriers sunk. Over 3,000 personnel killed. The loss of highly trained pilots and maintenance crews that could never be replaced. But what shocked Japanese intelligence officers afterward was not the tactical outcome. Battles are won and lost. What shocked them was the American damage control performance. The carrier Yorktown absorbed multiple bomb hits and torpedo strikes. It should have sunk immediately based on Japanese understanding of carrier vulnerability. Instead, American damage control parties kept the ship operational for hours. The carrier was hit by 3 bombs around noon on June 4th. The ship was dead in the water by 2:40 in the afternoon with fires burning, flight deck damaged, and power systems offline. Within 2 hours, damage control teams had restored power, patched flight deck holes with steel plates, and brought the ship to 20 knots. From zero, the carrier resumed air operations by 4 in the afternoon, launching and recovering aircraft as if the earlier damage had been minor. Japanese damage control doctrine relied on small, highly trained specialist teams working with minimal redundancy. The Americans seemed to have dozens of damage control personnel available on a single vessel with backup teams ready to take over if primary teams were incapacitated. Where did all those people come from? A Japanese fleet carrier operated with approximately 1,500 crew. Intelligence estimates suggested American carriers had similar manning, perhaps slightly higher. But the Yorktown's crew list, recovered from documents found floating after the battle, showed over 2,200 names. The Americans were putting nearly 50% more personnel on their carriers than Japanese planners had assumed. That meant 50% more damage control capability, 50% more maintenance capacity, 50% more sustained operations. Capability, 50% more everything. The implications were enormous. And still, Tokyo headquarters did not adjust their fundamental estimates of American naval strength. The third warning came in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major American offensive operation. Japanese intelligence had estimated that American forces in the South Pacific would be limited by personnel availability. They expected perhaps 2 or 3 reinforced battalions, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 men total for an initial landing operation. Marine forces landed with 11,000 troops on Guadalcanal, alone with additional forces landing on nearby Tulagi and other islands. The total American ground force commitment to the Solomon Islands operation exceeded 16,000 personnel. Naval forces supporting the landing included 3 aircraft carriers, a battleship, 14 cruisers, and 31 destroyers. The personnel required to operate and support that force exceeded 30,000 sailors, not counting the merchant marine crews manning transport vessels. American ground forces received continuous resupply from transport vessels crewed by merchant marine personnel who had been rapidly trained and deployed in a matter of months rather than years. Japanese submarines patrolling the supply routes watched convoys moving supplies to Guadalcanal and reported supply ship traffic at levels that seemed impossible for a navy Tokyo believed had fewer than 400,000 total personnel. The Americans were operating a major offensive campaign in the Solomon Islands while simultaneously maintaining Atlantic convoy operations against German submarines, conducting training exercises to prepare new units for deployment and building new construction crews for vessels under construction. The math did not work. Either Japanese intelligence numbers were fundamentally wrong, or the Americans had found some way to multiply their available manpower beyond any reasonable calculation. Tokyo chose to believe the Americans were overextended and would soon reach their breaking point. They kept waiting for that breaking point to arrive. It never did. By early 1943, field commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports to Tokyo. Admiral Ieyaku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, personally sent a cable to Naval General Staff Headquarters questioning the intelligence estimates. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921 and had served as naval attachés in Washington during the 1920s. He knew America better than most Japanese officers. He understood American industrial capacity and organizational capability from direct observation. His cable was blunt and undiplomatic. American naval forces in the Pacific had grown to levels that were incompatible with pre-war intelligence projections. Either the Americans had stripped the Atlantic theater bare of all naval forces and concentrated everything in the Pacific, which seemed unlikely given the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, or the personnel estimates that had informed Japanese strategic planning were fundamentally wrong. Tokyo needed to determine which scenario was correct and adjust planning accordingly. The situation could not continue with field commanders operating on assumptions that no longer matched observed reality. The request was assigned to intelligence officers in the Naval Intelligence Division who specialized in American naval analysis. They pulled every report from the past 18 months and started calculating actual American strength from observed deployments, American ship sightings, from submarine patrols and reconnaissance flights, radio intercepts revealing call signs and unit designations, prisoner interrogations providing direct testimony about unit sizes and manning, levels captured documents showing organizational structures and personnel allocations. They counted every vessel reported in the Pacific theater and calculated minimum crew requirements based on vessel type and mission. Then they added Atlantic operations visible through intelligence collection, convoy escorts, operating between the United States and Britain, carrier groups supporting amphibious operations in North Africa, training commands preparing new units on both coasts, shore stations providing maintenance, repair, and logistics support. The preliminary totals came to over 850,000 personnel. That was already more than double the official estimates that had been used for war planning. But the analysis was not finished. When American manning standards documented in captured operations manuals were applied to the observed ship counts, the total rose to 1,200,000. Music, and this was just active operational forces. It did not include the training pipeline of recruits undergoing basic training, technical schools preparing specialists, advanced training units working up for deployment, or the vast shore establishment of administrative and support personnel required to sustain operations. Intelligence officers wrote detailed reports, concluding that Japanese intelligence estimates of American naval manpower were low by a factor of at least 3:1, possibly 4:1, or even higher. The reports were submitted to senior leadership in the spring of 1943. They were read, questioned, and extensively debated. American expansion at such rates seemed impossible to officers who had spent their careers in a navy that grew slowly and carefully, one ship and one sailor at a time. The cultural assumption that mobilization had natural limits colored every analysis. The idea that America could train hundreds of thousands of sailors in months rather than years contradicted everything Japanese naval Culture understood about creating effective personnel. Training took time. Developing competence required experience. Building unit cohesion demanded careful selection and prolonged service together. The American approach of rapid mass mobilization seemed likely to produce poorly trained personnel operating at low efficiency. How could such a force be effective in combat? The question revealed the depth of the cultural misunderstanding. In July 1943, a captured American sailor provided dramatic confirmation that changed the nature of the debate. The sailor was a radio operator from a destroyer sunk off Kalimbangara during a night surface engagement. He was young, recently trained, and remarkably forthcoming during interrogation. Japanese interrogators often found American prisoners more willing to talk than their own personnel would have been in similar circumstances. The cultural differences extended even to captivity. The sailor told his interrogators about his training experience at boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois. He had trained with 4,000 other recruits in his company alone. He described the training facility as processing 20,000 new sailors every month through basic training programs that lasted 8 weeks. The interrogation officer asked him to repeat that number, certain there had been a translation error. 20,000 per month meant 240,000 new sailors per year from a single training facility. That was training capacity alone, producing raw recruits ready for technical school assignments. It did not include officer candidate schools preparing ensigns and junior grade lieutenants. It did not include specialized technical schools, training radiomen, gunners' mates, machinists' mates, and other ratings. It did not include advanced training facilities working up flight crews, submarine crews, and specialized units. The sailor mentioned casually that he had friends training at 3 other major facilities around the country with similar capacity. If each facility processed similar numbers, the Americans were adding close to 1 million new sailors per year to their personnel system. The interrogation report made it to Tokyo in August 1943. It was read by senior intelligence officers. It was filed with supporting documentation. And once again, it was questioned rather than fully accepted. The prisoner was probably exaggerating to impress his captors. He was probably confused about the actual numbers. He might have misunderstood what he was told during training. Prisoners say things for many reasons. The information was noted as potentially significant but not verified through independent sources and therefore not fully reliable for planning purposes. The institutional resistance to accepting uncomfortable truths remained powerful. The verification came from an unexpected source that could not be easily dismissed. In September 1943, a German submarine operating in the Atlantic transmitted a detailed report to Berlin describing convoy escort operations observed during a multi-day patrol. The report included technical observations of American destroyer escorts, their tactical performance, crew organization, and manning levels. German naval intelligence shared the report with their Japanese counterparts through the military attaché in Berlin as part of routine intelligence exchange between Axis powers. The German submarine commander had observed American destroyer escorts during a surface engagement and had counted personnel visible on deck during action stations. He estimated the American destroyer escort carried a crew of approximately 180 to 200 personnel. Japanese destroyer escorts of comparable size operated with crews of 100 to 120. The American vessels were not significantly larger in displacement or dimensions. They were simply more heavily manned. The Germans noted this as an operational curiosity worth sharing. For Japanese analysts, it was confirmation of a pattern they had been reluctant to acknowledge. If the Americans were putting 50% more crew on their escort vessels, they were probably doing the same across their entire fleet. Carriers with 50% more crew, battleships with 50% more crew, cruisers and destroyers and auxiliaries all carrying more personnel than Japanese estimates assumed. The implications were staggering. Every Japanese calculation about American fleet size, operational capability, and sustainability was based on manning assumptions that were demonstrably wrong. September 1943 was the month Tokyo finally, quietly began to acknowledge they had a fundamental problem with their understanding of American capabilities. A working group was formed in the Naval Intelligence Division specifically to reassess American personnel strength using all available information without regard to whether the conclusions fit existing assumptions. The group included experienced intelligence officers and operations planners who understood how personnel numbers translated into operational capability. They were given access to classified files from multiple sources and told to develop new estimates based on comprehensive analysis rather than incremental adjustments to old estimates. They worked for 6 weeks examining every piece of evidence systematically. Their report was submitted on November 9, 1943. The new estimate placed American naval personnel strength at approximately 1,800,000 as of mid-1943, with projected growth to 2,400,000 by mid-1944 based on observed expansion rates. This was still conservative compared to actual American strength. The working group hedged their estimates, reluctant to present numbers that seemed too extreme, even when evidence supported higher figures. But it was close enough to reality that the strategic implications could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The report included a detailed appendix analyzing what these revised numbers meant for Japanese war planning and strategic assumptions. If the Americans had nearly 2 million sailors currently in service with expansion continuing, they could simultaneously operate major fleet concentrations in multiple theaters without any mutual support or resource sharing between theaters. They could conduct unrestricted offensive operations in the Pacific while maintaining full-strength convoy escort operations in the Atlantic. They could sustain combat losses at rates Japan could never match and still expand total force strength. They could maintain extensive logistics networks, moving supplies across vast ocean distances. They could garrison island bases with permanent personnel rather than rotating limited forces. Every assumption that had informed Japanese strategy for the past 2 years was invalidated by these numbers. The defensive perimeter strategy that assumed limited American forces unable to attack multiple points simultaneously was obsolete. The quick war scenario that depended on American war weariness and willingness to negotiate was impossible. The Americans were not running out of manpower. They were not going to reach a breaking point where losses exceeded their ability to replace them. They were going to keep building ships and keep training crews and keep sending them west until Japan was crushed under the sheer weight of numerical superiority. The working group's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Japan had entered a war against an opponent whose mobilization potential was an order of magnitude greater than intelligence estimates had predicted. The error was not correctable through operational adjustments or tactical innovation. Superior Japanese training, superior Japanese fighting spirit, superior Japanese tactics could not overcome a 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage in personnel. The mathematics of the situation were absolute and immutable. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. The only question remaining was how long Japan could sustain the fight before inevitable collapse and whether any negotiated settlement could be reached before that collapse became complete. The report went to the highest levels of naval leadership. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, serving as Navy Minister, received a copy. Senior officers on the Naval General Staff read it carefully. The officers who read the report could not dispute the numbers or the analysis. The evidence was overwhelming. The methodology was sound. The conclusions were logically derived from verified observations. But they also could not share the report widely without triggering institutional crisis. If field commanders understood that the war was mathematically unwinnable based on personnel ratios alone, morale would collapse. Combat effectiveness depends partly on belief in possible victory. If the government understood that naval intelligence had miscalculated this badly at the most fundamental level, there would be demands for accountability and possibly leadership. Changes at the worst possible moment in the middle of a losing war. If the emperor understood that the war had been started based on intelligence estimates that were wrong by a factor of 8:1, the entire military leadership structure could be held responsible for a strategic disaster of unprecedented magnitude. The political implications were unacceptable. The report was classified at the highest security level. Distribution was restricted to fewer than 20 officers with operational need to know. The information was contained and controlled. Official estimates were quietly updated in internal planning documents used for resource allocation and operational planning. But no public announcement was made. No strategic reassessment was ordered that would have required explaining why fundamental assumptions had changed. The war continued as if nothing had changed, even though everything had changed. Field commanders were not informed of the revised estimates. They continued planning operations based on assumptions that the Americans were overextended and approaching their manpower limits. Those assumptions were wrong. They had always been wrong. And now people at the top knew they were wrong. But the machine of war was in motion and could not be stopped without admitting catastrophic institutional failure. By December 1943, actual American naval strength was 2,374,094. The Japanese had estimated 296,000. The miscalculation was 7.8 to 1. This was not a failure of intelligence collection. Japanese intelligence officers had access to most of the information they needed through multiple channels. Prisoner interrogations provided direct testimony from Americans who had been through the training system. Radio intercepts revealed organizational structures and unit designations that indicated force sizes. Ship sighting reports documented force levels in different theaters. Technical publications provided details about American training facilities and manning policies. The information was available and had been available throughout the war. The failure was analytical rather than empirical. Japanese intelligence officers could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America did. They looked at the raw data and interpreted it through their own cultural and organizational framework. They saw an American Navy that functioned like the Imperial Japanese Navy because that was the only model they understood. Every data point was filtered through assumptions about how navies worked, how personnel were trained, how units were organized, how mobilization proceeded. Those assumptions were based on Japanese experience and Japanese practices. They were completely wrong when applied to America. The intelligence officers were victims of their own assumptions, unable to see beyond their cultural blinders, even when evidence accumulated that contradicted those assumptions. The consequences played out over the next 2 years with brutal inevitability. In 1944, the United States deployed forces for simultaneous major operations across multiple theaters. The Central Pacific Offensive drove through the Marshall Islands and the Marianas toward the Philippines. The Southwest Pacific Campaign advanced along New Guinea toward the Dutch East Indies. Operations in the China, Burma, India theater supported Chinese resistance and prepared for eventual operations against the Asian mainland. And through all of this, full-strength naval forces remained committed to the Atlantic theater, escorting convoys, supporting amphibious operations in Europe, and maintaining pressure on German naval forces. Japanese commanders faced American task forces that seemed to multiply regardless of losses. Destroy one carrier group and 2 more appeared within weeks. Sink a dozen destroyers and 20 more joined the fleet. The following month, the Americans absorbed losses that would have crippled Japan and came back stronger every time. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japan committed its remaining carrier forces to what was intended as a decisive engagement that would American offensive capability. The Americans deployed a task force with 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The personnel operating that single task force numbered approximately 70,000. To put that in perspective, the entire Imperial Japanese Navy at the start of the war in December 1941 had fewer than 400,000 personnel across all branches, all shore establishments, all training, commands, and all administrative functions. The Americans were fielding individual task forces with manning levels that represented significant portions of Japan's entire naval strength, and they were running multiple task forces of similar size simultaneously in different operational areas. The scale of American mobilization had become visible in ways that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Japanese losses at Philippine Sea included 3 carriers and approximately 450 aircraft with their pilots and air crew. Catastrophic losses by any measure. The Americans lost 29 aircraft. Their carriers were back in full operation within hours. having replaced losses and resumed normal flight operations without any reduction in capability. The battle demonstrated in brutal clarity what unlimited personnel availability meant in practical terms. The Americans could absorb losses that would other navies, maintain operations without pause, and press attacks continuously. Because they had depth throughout their organization, they had reserves of trained personnel ready to replace losses immediately. They had training pipelines producing thousands of new sailors every month to sustain expansion and replace combat attrition. They had shore establishments large enough to support sustained operations indefinitely without degradation. Japan had none of those things. Every loss was permanent and irreplaceable. Every pilot killed represented years of training lost forever. Every ship sunk removed capability that could never be recovered given Japan's limited industrial capacity and personnel base. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with greater resources at every level, and the Americans had resources Japan could not match, regardless of fighting spirit or tactical skill. The most painful realization for the Japanese officers who understood the true situation was that the war had been lost before it started. Not because of tactical mistakes that could have been corrected, not because of strategic errors that could have been avoided with better planning, but because of an intelligence failure so fundamental that it made victory mathematically impossible regardless of how well Japan fought. If Japanese planners had known in 1941 that America would deploy over 2 million sailors in the Pacific theater alone by 1944, the entire strategic calculus would have been different. The argument that America lacked the will to fight a prolonged war becomes meaningless when America has the capacity to fight 3 major wars simultaneously in different hemispheres, without straining its mobilization capacity. The hope that Japan could seize territory and defend it successfully collapses when the enemy can generate replacement forces faster than Japan can inflict losses through combat attrition. The entire premise of Japanese strategy, achieving early victories that would establish a defensive perimeter and then forcing America to accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight a costly war of attrition, was based on assumptions about American limitations that were fundamentally incorrect from the beginning. Some historians argue that even with accurate intelligence about American mobilization capacity, Japan would have gone to war anyway. The oil embargo imposed by the United States left Japan facing economic strangulation that would have crippled its military and industrial capacity within months. The resource needs of the empire, particularly oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Southeast Asia, demanded military action to secure access. The military culture that dominated Japanese government prioritized honor and national prestige over pragmatic calculations of probable success. These arguments have considerable merit. The political and economic pressures pushing Japan toward war were real and severe, but they miss a crucial point about how wars are fought once they begin. Wars are fought by people who believe they can win, or at least believe that victory is possible if they fight hard enough and make the right tactical decisions. Accurate intelligence about American strength might not have prevented the war from starting given the pressures Japan faced, but it would have fundamentally changed how Japan fought that war once it began. With realistic estimates of American strength showing a 10-to-1 personnel advantage, Japanese planning might have focused on limited objectives rather than expansive territorial conquest. Defensive strategies might have received priority over offensive operations designed to achieve decisive victory. Earlier negotiation attempts might have been pursued more seriously before the strategic situation became completely hopeless. The war that actually occurred, with its total commitment to offensive operations across the Pacific and its categorical rejection of all compromise until final defeat, was only possible because Japanese leaders at all levels believed they were fighting an enemy with limited resources who would eventually tire of the conflict. That belief was wrong from the beginning, and the intelligence failure that created and sustained that belief cost Japan everything it sought to defend. Commander Chikataka Nakajima served with the Second Fleet and Combined Fleet from December 1941 until August 1945. His duties included assembling intelligence from multiple sources, preparing estimates of enemy capabilities and intentions, and analyzing naval operations to extract lessons for future planning. After the War ended, Nakajima was interviewed extensively by American naval intelligence officers who were documenting Japanese intelligence capabilities and understanding how Japan had assessed American strength. Throughout the war, the Americans wanted to understand their enemy's perceptions and identify intelligence successes and failures on both sides. They asked Nakajima directly about the intelligence failures regarding American manpower, mobilization, and why Japanese estimates had been so catastrophically wrong. Nakajima's explanation was candid and revealing. He explained that Japanese naval intelligence had been organizationally weak throughout the pre-war period and during the war itself. The service was chronically understaffed relative to its mission requirements. It was institutionally marginalized within the Navy's hierarchy, with intelligence assignments carrying lower prestige and fewer promotion opportunities than combat or command billets. Intelligence. Officers who raised concerns about American capabilities, especially concerns that suggested Japan was overmatched or facing stronger opposition than expected, were often dismissed or ignored by operations. Officers who had already committed to specific courses of action. The organizational system was not designed to challenge fundamental assumptions or question strategic premises established by senior leadership. It was designed to support decisions that had already been made by providing confirming information and tactical details. When intelligence assessments contradicted operational plans or suggested that strategic assumptions might be wrong, the intelligence was questioned rather than the plans. The institutional culture throughout the Japanese Navy made catastrophic miscalculation not just possible, but nearly inevitable. Accurate assessment requires the ability to accept uncomfortable truths. The Japanese system was not built to accept such truths when they conflicted with institutional preferences or strategic commitments. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada served as Navy Minister from October 18, 1941 to July 17, 1944, a period that covered the entire first phase of the Pacific War. He also briefly served concurrently as Chief of the Naval General Staff from February 21 to August 2, 1944, holding both positions simultaneously for approximately 5 months during a critical period of the war. After Japan's surrender, Shimada was arrested and tried before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East as a Class A war criminal. The charges included waging aggressive war, violating international law, and crimes against peace. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 11 years in Sugamo prison before being paroled in 1955 due to declining health. He died in 1976 at age 92, one of the last surviving senior admirals from the Imperial Japanese Navy. Throughout his remaining years, Shimada never publicly acknowledged the intelligence reports that had warned of American manpower superiority years before the war's end. In his testimony at trial and in later statements, he maintained that Japan had fought with honor and determination against overwhelming odds that could not have been foreseen. This narrative was true in one sense. Japan did fight with honor and determination, but it was also fundamentally incomplete. Japan fought with honor against odds that its own intelligence services had catastrophically underestimated in the pre-war period, but that senior leadership, including Shimada himself, had failed to adequately address or respond to once evidence of those true odds became apparent during the war. The institutional failure extended beyond initial miscalculation to include failure to adapt and adjust when reality contradicted assumptions. The final accounting was brutal in its simplicity and mathematical certainty. Japan began the war with approximately 120,000 naval personnel. This included the professional officer corps, the enlisted sailors serving on ships and at shore stations, and the administrative and support personnel required to maintain the service. The nation expanded that force to approximately 300,000 by 1945 through sustained mobilization efforts. Total mobilization over 4 years of total war produced a threefold increase in naval personnel. By any historical standard, this represented impressive expansion for a nation of Japan's size and industrial capacity. Impressive by any standard except the one that mattered in the context of the Pacific War. The United States began the war with approximately 337,000 naval personnel in December 1941. By the War's end in August 1945. That force had grown to over 3,380,000. A tenfold increase achieved in less than 4 years. The Americans trained and deployed more sailors in the single year of 1944 than Japan had in its entire navy at its peak wartime strength. They operated more ships than Japan could build. They flew more aircraft than Japan could manufacture. They moved more supplies across greater distances than Japan could transport. They sustained more forces in more places, simultaneously than Japanese planners had thought possible for any nation. The intelligence estimate that projected 296,000 American sailors by December 1943 missed the actual number of 343 by a factor of nearly 8 to 1. This was not a small error that could be attributed to reasonable uncertainty about future events. This was not an excusable miscalculation resulting from incomplete information or deceptive enemy practices. This was a complete failure to understand the fundamental nature of the enemy Japan was fighting, and that failure determined the outcome of the war before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor, before the first American ship was sunk, before the first battle was fought. The numbers made victory impossible regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance or fighting spirit. Intelligence working groups produced comprehensive reassessments in late 1943, showing that American strength was far beyond anything Japanese planning had assumed. The officers who compiled these reports, working with all available information and applying rigorous analytical methods, understood exactly what the numbers meant for Japan's strategic position. The war was lost. The mathematics were absolute. No amount of tactical success could overcome such fundamental numerical disadvantage. But the system was not designed to act on uncomfortable truths that undermined the entire basis for continuing the war. The institutional incentives all pointed toward suppressing such information rather than acting on it. The reports were classified at the highest security levels. Distribution was restricted to the smallest possible group with operational need to know. Operational planning continued based on outdated assumptions because changing those assumptions would have required admitting that the entire strategic foundation of the war had been built on false premises from the beginning. Sometimes intelligence is about gathering information from enemy territory and hostile sources. Sometimes it is about analyzing that information to extract meaningful patterns and predictions. And sometimes, perhaps most importantly, it is about discovering uncomfortable truths that nobody wants to hear and nobody wants to accept. The tragedy of Japanese naval intelligence in World War II was not that they eventually discovered the truth about American strength. They did eventually figure out that their estimates had been catastrophically wrong. The tragedy was that when they finally understood the truth, the institutional and political structures that governed decision-making prevented that truth from changing the course of the war or even significantly influencing operational planning. The truth was discovered, documented, and then buried because acting on it would have required admitting failures that the system could not acknowledge. Wars are lost through fundamental miscalculations about who you are fighting and what resources they can bring to bear. The Japanese looked at America and saw a nation that would mobilize the way Japan mobilized, slowly and carefully with emphasis on quality over quantity. They estimated manpower requirements using Japanese models and Japanese assumptions about training time and personnel development. They prepared to fight a war against an enemy that existed primarily in their own imaginations, an enemy that matched their preconceptions about how modern industrial nations conducted warfare. The real enemy, the one that actually existed rather than the one they imagined, operated on a completely different scale with completely different assumptions about what was possible. The real enemy had unlimited manpower reserves and the organizational capacity to turn civilians into sailors in months rather than years. The real enemy could sustain losses that would have destroyed Japan and still expand total force strength. The real enemy could fight multiple major wars simultaneously in different hemispheres without choosing between them. That enemy destroyed Japan not because American sailors were individually superior or American ships were better designed, though both were often true, but because there were simply so many more of them. So many more that Japanese intelligence could not imagine the numbers, even when evidence accumulated that should have made the truth obvious. 296,000 estimated, 234, 343. Actual. That gap between assumption and reality, between what Japan thought it was fighting and what it actually faced, tells the complete story of how one catastrophic intelligence failure determined the outcome of the Pacific War before the war truly began. The numbers were always there in American technical publications and census data and industrial statistics. The data was available to anyone who wanted to see it. What was missing was the ability to see beyond cultural assumptions and organizational limitations to understand an enemy that operated on a completely different scale with completely different rules. And that blindness, that inability to see what should have been obvious, cost Japan everything it fought to preserve. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe my channel to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories